Can you please make me host?
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. We're just letting everybody in from the waiting room and we'll start in the next couple of minutes. While we're waiting to start, I will share a few housekeeping announcements for everybody just before we start the meeting. So for this webinar, we do have French and Spanish interpretation via the app, which is called Interprify. So have a look at the webpage, which we'll also put into the chat here, and you can find there the information on how to access the Spanish and the French translation through a token. This webinar is a training webinar. It will be recorded, and the different language versions will be made available on demand on the website. And they'll serve as valuable resources now and also in the years to come and added onto the LCIPP web portal. We'd like to ask the speakers to please keep their videos on throughout the event, and we kindly ask participants that are not panelists to turn off their videos just to help us with the broadband. Unless you're speaking during the Q&A, then feel free to put on your videos. So most importantly, we'd like to ask everybody to please keep your microphone muted throughout unless you're speaking. Thank you very much.
Tiffany, I think I saw Atencio Lopez's name.
Yes, Delia Atencio is online.
Perfecto. Maybe I'll wait just one more minute.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good
Buenos
morning.
días.
Hello, Daily. ¿Cómo
Yes,
está?
Bien, bien. Gracias. ¿De tú?
Sí, ahora mismo estoy viajando a la ciudad de Panamá. Estoy en el carro, pero voy a participar.
Ah. If possible.
So Daly, he's just on the way to Panama, but he's happy to participate. Maybe you can have him as the last speaker just to give him a chance.
Okay.
To get to Panama City.
Okay, and Marcelo will begin now, and then Marcelo can take care of the follow-up.
So Daly, we can start with the whole thing, and then maybe you can
Yep.
put Atencio as the fourth speaker.
Yeah, will do. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining this training webinar, and good morning. I'm presently in Anchorage, Alaska, where the hour is very, very early. Uvanga Napagiak. My name is Daly Sambodero. I am the International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and I'm a member of the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform on behalf of the Arctic region. And many may know that the Arctic region is actually comprised of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Sami Council. So we work very closely with our Sami colleagues on behalf of the Arctic region. And as I said earlier, I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, and awoke at about 5 a.m. this morning to begin this initial activity of the Facilitative Working Group. I'll allow my co-lead, Eli, to introduce himself now.
Thank you, Daly, and good morning and good afternoon and evening to everybody. So my name is Eli Abarisk. Normally, I would be a party representative representing Canada. I'm currently in Ottawa, Ontario, so I'm the capital. But today I'm joining you as the representative on the Facilitative Working Group for the Western Europe and Others group representing that region. And I'm pleased to be here and to be working with Daly on this webinar. So hello again.
Just some quick background on the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform and the Facilitative Working Group. The Facilitative Working Group is the first UN constituted body with equal representation between states and Indigenous peoples. And it intends to operationalize the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which was created within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. For Indigenous peoples, the framework for the FWG is based on respect for and recognition of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the rights affirmed therein. Indigenous peoples are able to self-select their representatives to the FWG, which is in contrast to the other Indigenous-specific mandates within the United Nations. To date, the Facilitative Working Group has developed a 2-year work plan for the platform according to 3 functions: knowledge, capacity development, and climate policy. Function 2, which is the context by which this activity is going to take place, focuses on capacity for engagement, which also informs the knowledge function of the Facilitative Working Group. So activity 4 of the Facilitative Working Group is a series of thematic training workshops to build capacity for engaging Indigenous peoples in the relevant work, both within the UNFCCC and outside of the UNFCCC. Our original intent was to hold an in-person training, but due to the ongoing pandemic, we had to shift to this virtual series of webinars. Significantly, this first webinar series focuses on the capacity and the need to build the capacity of state parties to the UNFCCC and relevant institutions in order to engage with Indigenous peoples and to gain the insights of Indigenous knowledge holders in relation to climate change and other related issues. I'll hand it off to Eli.
Thanks, Daly. I'll be brief. As Daly mentioned, the webinar series will focus on building parties' capacity to understand and ethically engage with Indigenous peoples and on Indigenous knowledge. So I think as many of you know, Indigenous peoples have been the stewards of the land, the water, ice, since time immemorial. The knowledge system they've built are based on generations of observing, of understanding, of living off the land. So their leadership and their knowledge are critical to addressing climate change. So I think the international community, the parties recognize the importance of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous-led climate action when we created the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. And as part of that platform, we mandated a knowledge function, as Daly just said. And this is to basically exchange experiences, best practices, with a view to applying, strengthening, and protecting and preserving knowledge, technologies, practices of Indigenous peoples on climate change. So, but I think the key thing, and I wanted to highlight here, is that for this knowledge function to be meaningfully implemented, there needs to be a shared trust, obviously, and understanding between parties and Indigenous peoples. As Daly just mentioned, the equal representation on the facilitative working group was a great step forward in that respect. I think a lot of us know that for too long, Indigenous peoples and their knowledge had been subjected to ongoing marginalization by governments, Western scientific research practices, and frankly, past colonial policies. But through the platform that we've created, and especially this series of webinars, we really hope to break that mold, to create the conditions to begin a true knowledge partnership between Indigenous peoples and the UNFCCC. So through the series of these, the 4 webinars, and ideally concluding in an in-person event, fingers crossed, we'll aim to provide you with an overview of what is and what is not Indigenous knowledge, the human rights framework that underpins ethical engagement with Indigenous knowledge, successful examples of ethical engagement with Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate change, and work to identify and explore future opportunities for partnership. Over the 4, so starting today and over the rest of the webinar series, we will feature speakers from all 7 sociocultural Indigenous regions of the world to ensure we have a holistic view of the different perspectives concerning Indigenous peoples. Although we aren't able to hear from all 7 regions today, or necessarily at each webinar, rest assured that all regions will have the opportunity to present their perspectives. So today we will hear from 4 of those regions. So while the lineup of Indigenous speakers obviously are far better suited than me to speak to these issues, I did want to highlight one key point, and that is, as it's fundamental, understanding and ethically engaging with Indigenous peoples and their knowledge means recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. I think that's basically one of those, it's a foundation. These rights have been articulated in several declarations, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and several others, and are frankly the bedrock of this partnership. So this, of course, means recognizing specific rights to maintain, to control, to protect, and develop their knowledge, and to the right to free, prior, and informed consent of any use of their knowledge. But it also means the broader recognition of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples as right holders and partners in the fight against climate change. I just really wanted to highlight that as well. So let's begin our discussion, and back over to you, Daly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Eli, especially for underscoring the human rights framework with which we want to carry forward not only this activity, but all of the activities concerning Indigenous peoples within the UNFCCC. The questions that we hope to explore in this brief webinar include: what is Indigenous knowledge? What are the core elements of Indigenous knowledge? And why is it essential to bring a human rights framework to this issue? And also, where can we see specific references to Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge in climate change work? We would like to underscore that we'll not address the topic of local knowledge in this webinar and indeed the series, based on the principle that Indigenous peoples can only speak to their knowledge and not speak on the knowledge of others. We want to refer all participants to the website and the upcoming portal for more information, including the concept note prepared for this webinar series. In addition, I want to underscore that we would like to invite participants to share information with us about Indigenous knowledge and climate change in order to assist us in substantiating the significance of Indigenous knowledge in relation to climate change and the importance of respecting and recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples to their profound knowledge. And we hope that this introduction to this critical area will be revealed in the first of this series of 4 webinars. We have set up a format, and I'll just briefly describe that, and then we'll begin to move into the presentations. So for the format today, we will go through a series of 10-minute presentations from each Indigenous expert, and we've invited 4 of them to join us today. This will be followed by a question and answer period, including questions from us as the facilitators or the co-leads for this activity, as well as any questions that might come in via the chat tool. We'll then offer a brief summary and wrap up the session. Some quick reminders: we would like to urge you to use the chat feature for posing questions. We'd also respectfully ask that you focus on the matter of Indigenous knowledge. And again, just to remind you that this is an introductory session to a larger activity, including the 3 remaining webinars on Indigenous knowledge. And in terms of our curating the remaining 3 sessions, we look forward to ensuring that all sociocultural regions of Indigenous peoples will be engaged, as Eli has indicated. So I'd now like to turn to our presenters. The first presenter is a good friend and longtime colleague who I haven't seen in decades, Naomi Kapuri, who is a Maasai and educated as an anthropologist. Dr. Kapuri has served as a trustee of the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples and also a participant in past UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues sessions. Her promotion and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights on the African continent includes NGO work, community mobilization, advocacy, documentation, and research. She was an expert member of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, undertaking numerous country missions. Presently, she is the chairperson of the Kajiado, I hope I pronounced that at least close to correct, County Task Force on Culture and Heritage, where she is documenting historical and cultural institutions in order to establish a museum and a cultural center for the county. She is also the founder of the Arid Lands Institute, which emphasizes sustainable land use, environmental protection, and gender equity in access, control, and ownership of productive resources. And she is the executive director of the Society for Indigenous Culture and Knowledge Systems, encouraging production and documentation of historical, cultural, and human interest materials of significance. I am very pleased to provide Dr. Kapuri with this opportunity to share her views on Indigenous knowledge. Please, Naomi, you have the screen. You unmute, please, Naomi. Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, and good evening. It's good evening in my time. It's 6 o'clock East African time. I'm very pleased to see Daly again after so many years. It's nice to connect with everybody in this interesting topic. The human rights, let's see, what can I say? The human rights angle here has to do with the fact that in my part of the world, and I think it's everywhere in the world, indigenous communities live in marginal areas, or they've been pushed to marginal areas, and their livelihoods have been highly dependent on natural resources, and they're the most vulnerable to climate change. So the significance has to do with the fact that human rights have been violated, and therefore they are more vulnerable than other communities. In Africa, many indigenous communities have been pushed, and by either government policy or by the more numerous communities in their respective areas. And the lands that they find themselves in are fragile lands. And as a consequence of this historical, social, political, and economic exclusion, are among those that are at greatest risk of losing their livelihoods following climate change. The definitional issues of indigenous and local knowledge, we said we don't have to worry about local knowledge, but I think in Africa, I think some local communities find themselves in the same situation as indigenous peoples. I find the CBD definition of indigenous peoples, Article 8J, very useful in understanding the indigenous knowledge systems. I see it as knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities around the world. They've been developed from experiences gained over the centuries and adapted to the local cultures and environment. Traditional knowledge is transmitted orally, mostly, from generation to generation, and it has to be collective. It is shared by members of particular communities, and it takes the form of stories, songs, folklore, and proverbs. Also cultural values, beliefs, rituals, community laws, local language, and agricultural practices, including development of plant species and animal breeds. Traditional knowledge is mainly of a practical nature, particularly in such fields as agriculture, fisheries, health, horticulture, forestry, and environmental management in general. So that's how we understand indigenous knowledge. The next point is core elements of indigenous knowledge that I see as indigenous knowledge incorporating all aspects of life, spirituality, history, cultural practices, social interactions, language, healing, and so on. And a combination of attributes, including especially adaptation for survival, you need to adapt to the natural environment for survival. And this is based on historical experiences, but adapts to social and economic, environmental, spiritual, and political changes. So indigenous communities adapt to the environment in various ways as a way of surviving and ensuring that their livelihoods are met. The indigenous knowledge has different attributes. Besides being adaptive, it's also cumulative. Over the years, from generation to generation, is passed from one generation to the next, and in close proximity to nature. Elders pass it on to the children as generations come and go. It's also dynamic. Indigenous knowledge is dynamic. It is not static. And it has developed and adopted over millennia, in the sense that when conditions change, it changes. Indigenous knowledge changes with the circumstances, with the conditions that indigenous communities find themselves in. It is also holistic. All aspects of life are interconnected as part of a whole. Holistic in the sense that it is not focused on one item, but is all connected together. It's also not really, it doesn't seek to control nature. Instead, it seeks to live in harmony with nature. I remember a time I went to fetch firewood with my mother, and she looked up at a tree before she cut a branch. And I asked her, "Why are you murmuring to this tree?" And she said, "I have to ask permission to cut its branches." So we made a joke about it, but it still rings in my head that you have to respect a tree before you cut its branches. And in effect, she was asking the tree to allow her to cut a branch because the tree has the capacity of regrowing and regenerating, while my mother did not have a way of feeding her children unless she cut a branch of the tree. So that is how it respects nature. It doesn't seek to control nature, but live with it in harmony. It's also intergenerational. It's passed down orally through language, songs, stories, legends, ceremonies, and proverbs, and all sorts of other means, some of which are really, at the moment, indigenous peoples are having a hard time retaining their indigenous knowledge. And some of these ways of passing down through generations is becoming very difficult. It is also invaluable. You can say it is the key to sustainable social and economic development. You cannot say this has value and this does not have value. All of it has value and is all interconnected. It's also irreplaceable. I guess once you lose your indigenous knowledge, you lose it. You can't find it anywhere else unless it's written down. And quite often it is not. The nuances of indigenous knowledge are just there. People either know them or they don't. And many indigenous peoples, at least in Africa, have not been able to record their indigenous knowledge systems. It's also moral. There's morality in interacting with nature, and there's responsibility as you do so. As I gave the example before, there's respect of nature almost all the time, and that keeps it in balance so that there's continuous interaction between human beings and nature, indigenous peoples and nature, in such a way that you don't destroy it. It's also non-linear but cyclical. So you don't go from it's not a straight line, but it's cyclical most of the time. Most of the time it is elders, and in Africa actually it's elders who have this knowledge. The younger generations have little of it, and it's more effective if the elders could find sustainable ways of passing down the knowledge to younger generations before it all disappears. In fact, in Africa, they say when an old person dies, the whole library has gone down the drain. Because most of the indigenous knowledge is passed orally. Other elements, I would say responsibility, spirituality, is unique, is valid, and does not require validation of Western science. Sometimes when people go to school, it's like you're being told, you're being taught knowledge. And that in a way you have to forget the knowledge that you already had when you came to school. And in the process, you actually end up believing that you didn't know anything. And children go to school feeling that they don't know anything, they're going to be taught. But I remember an old man once, when all his children were asked to go to school, he said he wants to keep one child so that he wants to keep an intelligent child so that she does not become less intelligent when she goes to school. It's the first time I heard an old man thinking that when people go to school, they don't learn, but they actually lose the knowledge they had from the indigenous culture. And that is actually true. We go to school and we lose so much. We think we came back with so much knowledge, but we've actually lost so much that we desperately need in order to survive, because the conditions in most parts of Africa where indigenous peoples have found themselves have not really changed since we were children. There's still no water. We still depend pretty much on natural resources for livelihoods. And there's still no running water. There's still no electricity. There's still not so many things of the modern life. So we still need that indigenous knowledge that would help us to live with not just the present nature, but the circumstances that are changing with climate change. So I think it's very, very important to remind the world that indigenous knowledge is so important for the world to share, not just for the indigenous peoples to utilize, but the world to share in its meaning, the nuances. And I think it's all communities have different ways of relating to nature. And in Africa, I think we're still very, very close to nature as far as indigenous peoples are concerned. I remember when I went to a Tanzanian indigenous community once, not too long ago. We took a long, long time to get there. And I kept on asking, are we almost there? Are we almost there? And the indigenous community person, it's a community called the Barbaig of Tanzania, said, you will know when you get close to our country because we don't cut trees. So before we get there, trees have been cut down, charcoal has been burnt, and trees have been felled. But like us, they also don't cut trees. They cut branches of trees when they want to use them. So I think the world needs to know that to protect the environment, you need to retain some of the indigenous knowledge systems that indigenous peoples alone have. If, for instance, other communities neighboring us had known this, then they'll probably respect as a knowledge, not just a habit, but a knowledge that is valuable in order to protect nature, especially in the changing circumstances. Am I out of time? Maybe I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kayana. Thank you so much, Naomi, for especially the reference to the elder who wanted to keep a child from going to school, and the importance and significance of that, as well as the message about maintaining indigenous knowledge. It's like maintaining the environment. You have to maintain both. I'll now hand it off to Eli to introduce our next speaker, or because we had an adjustment, I think that I now will, yes, okay, it's my responsibility to introduce Namin, because we had we had an adjustment as the participants may have noticed at the outset, the rocky start of this webinar, that we'll have Atencio Lopez join us once he's settled in Panama. So I'm now pleased to introduce Na Min, who is an Indigenous woman from Myanmar. Since 2013, she's been the director at the Promotion of Indigenous and Nature Point, or excuse me, Nature Together, or the acronym POINT, an organization led by Indigenous peoples working with and for Indigenous peoples throughout Myanmar. She is also the Executive Council member of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and AIPP is a regional organization of the Indigenous peoples from Asia based in Chiang Mai, Thailand. She has a Master of Arts in International Development Studies and a diploma in environmental policy. Na Min has been proactively engaging in the national, sub-regional, regional, and international advocacy forums representing Indigenous peoples and particularly Indigenous women. She has received the U.S. Embassy's Women of Change Award. This was in 2017. So we're very, very pleased to now offer the screen to you, Na Min, to share your views on the matter of Indigenous knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. You can hear me very well. Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. You can call me EE as well for easier. And that's also represent the work I'm doing, environment and Indigenous people that I'm working on. Today, I'm happy to share about Indigenous knowledge, which is very much important for our Indigenous people. So first, I would like to define Indigenous knowledge. I think it's already covered by the first speaker already. It is very much important as part of our culture. It is also our intellectual heritage. And as mentioned before, it's passed from generation to generation. And it is part of our customary law as well. And Indigenous knowledge are our belief as well, and is our part of our identity as well. There are international level, there are ways of acknowledging traditional knowledge. But here I would like to stress on the thing that what is different about Indigenous knowledge is the knowledge that belong to Indigenous people. And if the knowledge that does not belong to Indigenous people, it will be in the public domain or in other way. It is part of our traditional knowledge. For us, the knowledge of Indigenous people is our knowledge that I would like to define in a simple way. And what are the core elements of Indigenous knowledge? I think it's also covered with the first speaker as well, but I would like to say that it is part of our daily life. We use it in our daily living style and every day of our life. And it is part of our healing, and it is taking care of our health, and it is our social life. Many things about our social relationship and social dealing. It has many things that give us as a guidance, and how to take care of our natural resources and how to take care of our forests and all the biodiversity we have. They are there to take care of the environment, and they are there for our livelihood, how to plant and how to cultivate, how to take care of our food, everything about our livelihood and self-sufficient economy. They are there for us. And spirituality as well. And in terms of governance and customary land tenure management, everything is related and based on our Indigenous knowledge. And this all are helping us to guide in our decision making and in our daily life. However, because of the changing world and changing of climate and everything, we also notice that it is constantly evolving as well. Then I would like to talk about human rights framework. In our country, just would like to give with the example that more of the current law and policy, they are there for traditional knowledge, not specifically to indigenous knowledge, but some of them cover the part that are element of indigenous knowledge as well. Like in Myanmar, we have copyright law, traditional, and also as part of the engagement with UNFCCC, the nationally determined contribution, the NDC of Myanmar, is specifically mentioned about indigenous technology. However, there is no specific anything about indigenous people or indigenous knowledge that we encounter so far, and we really hope that this will improve in the future as well. And as part of CBD under the Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing, for that it is especially for traditional knowledge, but part of it we try to engage in the process for the protection and related to indigenous knowledge as well. These are the law and policy happening at the country level when there are already existing mechanism at the international level and regional level. So our concern as part of human rights framework here is that many countries in Asia, also in Myanmar, there is a lack of recognition of indigenous people. Maybe we say that, oh, everyone in the country, we are pre-colonial period, we settle here, all are indigenous people. There is no specific thing to talk about indigenous people. Then it's also in turns also ignoring or lack of recognition of indigenous knowledge as well. So this is our concern, the most important one as part of human rights framework in our country context and similar to other Asian countries as well. So I just would like to, there are a lot of examples. The more I explore into, the more I learn a lot, but I just want to take out and give one as an example. I actually, I put as the link of the website here as well. But here, the first thing is like just to show example of Livingston, part of the Livingston. And the photo here show and say that about building the house is written in current language, but I want to highlight this as part of climate change adaptation. In terms of building the house for current people, we already have a kind of restriction that, for example, in the photo issue of river, the river look like a snake. If a river is like those kind of shape, people should not build house nearby, because it can change, the river flow will change anytime, and it will be have the indigenous people who settled there, we have problem. This is just one example. There are many areas and certain restriction that people should not build house in certain areas so that they can avoid a natural disaster and things like that. And here are the list of 13 things that current people believe that if these 13 things happen to people, they will have a big disaster or natural disaster will coming soon to our region. That's the way we believe in. And although we can say that maybe because of our experience, we come up with this kind of 13 list. No, this is we already have in our indigenous knowledge these 13, but in reality, current people most of the time they face with only eight problems so far. But they say that if these 13 happen, they will have a big disaster. But these 13, as a global scale, is already happening everywhere in the world. But we have this kind of knowledge that saying that this will have a big disaster. That's also exactly what is happening with the climate change now, like the earthquake, like the insect, a kind of rats problem, and when the bamboo blossom and the paddy, if they become very white color, and then when there is a disease for animal, they are listed with a certain knowledge system and mention about, I mean, like even predict about climate change, things like that. It's there in our knowledge system. This is just giving with one example of one indigenous group, but there are many indigenous groups, especially in Asia. We are very rich in culture and very rich with the way we live with natural environment. There are a lot to explore more, and there are a lot of things that we might be able to help contribute to combating climate change with our traditional knowledge. That's the thing I want to stress here. And another thing, we talk about a lot of things for adaptation we have there. And as part of mitigation, I only want to give example of the way the shifting cultivation, which is like a kind of like debate debate at the moment at every level, internationally or nationally. We have to debate about shifting cultivation. But like COVID time, it can be a good example. Place of shifting cultivation, the place where they have multiple seeds and plants and everything, they can continue with their own supermarket. When people like us, sometime in the city, we only get limited product available for us during COVID restriction. But for them living in the forest, they have everything, continue with their supermarket. And there are variety of crops. And nowadays, if we look at to the world agricultural sector, we need to maintain our traditional seeds. And indigenous people are there with their way of practicing shifting cultivation. They already maintain it. And however, we are very much concerned that it is becoming like ongoing debate about way of living and the government restriction on the use of and the practice of shifting cultivation. I would like to highlight this part of our important mitigation measure and of indigenous knowledge contributing to climate change. And like a REP Plus program, they are implemented in different countries. And in those, we need to discuss and think more about indigenous knowledge and the way our livelihood system, which is associated to climate change action. And another thing I would like to highlight is the strong connection we have with biodiversity and indigenous knowledge. All our indigenous knowledge is talking about plants, talking about the different animal. Even current people, they really like, if you have cat and dog at home, you will never be starving, something like that. Actually, they believe that if there are certain animal with you, you will never be starving. You will have no problem about your food security. And here, this is the two things apart from climate change, I would like to highlight about health. These are the two indigenous group. One on the left is a Shochin community. On the right is the Danube ethnic group from Myanmar. When a woman gave birth to a child, they need to use certain vegetable for their health, for their maternal health. No, these are the fruits and the vegetable, everything they got from the forest are the provided from their indigenous knowledge for their health care system. And that's why those biodiversity are very much important for indigenous knowledge system for our indigenous people. So I come up with some of the recommendation. Actually, if I have to share all of the indigenous knowledge from different topics, it will take a lot of time. But we are here, we are there just to give example and just to highlight that we want to be part of this global struggle together. And we always say that things global and act local. So when we think about climate change problem at the global level, we need to act at the local level. At the local, we indigenous people are there and we really want to be part of the solution. And that's why we come up with some of those recommendations here. This recommendation we already submitted to UNFCCC as a joint submission with AIPP and IGIA. We also give input from Asia aspect that first is very much important. It has been many years that we engage in the climate change and UNFCCC process. So there are small space opening up for indigenous people. Those are small. That's why we really hope that it implement all UNFCCC decisions related to indigenous people so that we are part of the solution. And we also hope that recognize indigenous people as partner in the protection of biodiversity and climate action. This is very much important because not only international level, we need to recognize at the national level as well. That's why the next recommendation is that we hope that it's established indigenous people climate platform at national and local level as well. Now we have this LCIPP platform. It should link back to national level action as well. That's why we want to have it at the national level. And then, as I mentioned before, the NDC, the current NDC, they don't give they don't pay attention to indigenous people role as well as indigenous knowledge. That's why when country revise their NDC, we want that it implement nationally determined contribution with indigenous people participation, full and effective participation. And then when we say indigenous people, as mentioned before, women are important. They are the one who pass this knowledge to their children. They play important role as well. Youth, they need to learn because we don't want it disappear, those knowledge. And a person with disability, because it's also important that their role. And another thing is land. Without land, how can we have our livelihood? Without land, how can we continue taking care of our knowledge? That's why it's also important to ensure indigenous knowledge. And for that knowledge, we also need to have a customary land rights and governance system of indigenous people. And as part of all the action taken at the international and national level. This is thing that we would like to give recommendation for the process. And at the Asia level, at AIPP, we now started with the formation and establishment of indigenous knowledge and people of Asia, a kind of indigenous people network of collecting of indigenous knowledge and documentation and advocacy process. Here, I also share the links so that you can explore more as well. And this is my last slide. I already say thank you, W, in our current language. Here, you may see a man. What is he doing? How do you think? We cannot talk here, no? But if you can guess what it is, the answer is already in Burmese language here. But if you can think of what is this, no, it would be good. Or what he is doing is for what? Something like that. Just a question left for you. Thank you very much. And it's time to act together. So whenever we say climate change, we say that everyone need to involve. So we are there and we are proposing that we want to be part of it. So why not opening more roles and door for us, no? Indigenous people and our knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Namin. That was a great presentation. I really appreciated also one of your last slides about the on the engagement and the importance of ensuring Indigenous people are engaged in the domestic processes, the implementation of our NDCs, of our national adaptation plans, and I think this is really the key in terms of all the discussions we're having now and putting them in practice. And I think that's a very good way to sort of end that presentation. So we will now turn to Victoria Bushman, who will be our next presenter. So I'll give you guys a quick intro to Victoria. Victoria is a Inuit wildlife and conservation biologist, originally from Utqiagvik, which is a small town in northern Alaska. I do apologize for my pronunciation, so please correct me. So she specializes broadly in the conservation of lands, waters, and species in the Arctic indigenous homelands. And she does work for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group, which is part of the Arctic Council. And and the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources. She lives in Nuuk, Greenland. Her work in research and policy focuses on promoting partnerships with Indigenous communities, knowledge, and governance to develop ethically conscious and culturally relevant and fully knowledge-based conservation efforts in the Arctic region and in favor of Arctic Indigenous peoples. So with that, I turn it over to Victoria, and thanks again for agreeing to be here.
Hi, thank you, Eli, for that introduction. My name is Victoria Kutuk-Bushman, and I'm from Ukavik, Alaska. I actually live now in Greenland, where I am calling from today. So it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll do my best to be brief, but very descriptive. I'm really happy to be here to share sort of the Inuit perspective on Indigenous knowledge. And this is a little bit tricky because perhaps you know, Inuit as an artifact of our colonial histories actually belong to 4 separate countries, right? So we're in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka in Russia. So we have a wide geographic spread, though culturally are extremely similar within ourselves. Under the threat of climate change, we've been increasingly asked to engage in issues related to research, management, governance, and policymaking in the Arctic, especially because the Arctic is warming approximately 6 times faster than the global average. So this is a new time for us where a lot of eyes all across the globe seem to be looking at us. And we're increasingly being asked to contribute our time and our labor and our knowledge to some of these global efforts. I'm a conservation biologist, and so some of the things that I'm going to talk about are more related to biodiversity, but I will do my best to share things as holistically as possible. Eli did mention that I do work for the Inuit Circumpolar Council as a consultant and contractor. There's a new project that I just want to highlight briefly called the Circumpolar Inuit Engagement Project, which is looking at bringing in all Inuit rules, laws, values, guidelines, and protocols for the equitable and ethical engagement of our knowledge and our communities. So this project is about 1 year old, and the perspectives that I'm sharing with you today actually come from my work this past year, speaking with Inuit across all 4 of our countries to talk about how do we want to be engaged? How do we want our knowledge to be engaged, particularly at the international level? So like the 2 previous speakers have already said, very descriptive of what Indigenous knowledge is. I'll share a little bit about our particular perspective on Indigenous knowledge. For us, Indigenous knowledge, Inuit Kalumai Tukangait, whatever you want to call it, is a living, breathing system of knowledge. It's living and breathing because it lives within individuals. So within science, we have these repositories where you can go find manuscripts, and those are your citations when you're talking about developing policy. For us, the people are the places that this knowledge is held, and this is complicated because there's no easy way to go in and find that information. It's within each and all of us, and this knowledge isn't necessarily owned by individuals. It's owned collectively by communities, by regions. And this knowledge is extremely descriptive and knowledgeable about environmental systems, about cultural systems, and particularly about societal values. Even our values are considered part of our Indigenous knowledge. And this is because our values that teach us how to engage with the world and teach us how to engage with society encourage us to live our lives as sustainably as possible. Like Naomi's story about the tree branches and asking permission, the values that we have really encourage us to live life sustainably. Our knowledge systems, for example, are really good at being descriptive of things like sea ice dynamics and basic physics, wildlife movement ecologies, where animals choose to be and why, and what kinds of environments do they like, which can be extremely predictive of what we're going to be going through as the climate continues to change. It's managing human and wildlife-borne diseases, emergence and vectors and things like this that are going to be really critically important to us as we move forward and things begin changing. Indigenous knowledge is really good at identifying this and predicting what will happen. Similar to science, our knowledge system has a validation process. Within science, we have the scientific process and peer review. But for us, we have cultural practice and intergenerational exchange, which ensures that our knowledge system not only is very comprehensive in terms of collecting past information, but is really good at including new information and is extremely adaptable. So it's an incredibly large body of information, and some of the knowledge that we have goes back thousands of years. And there are stories that within our knowledge systems that show, in fact, that some of this knowledge has been carried over for 1,000 years. Things that are going to be really important for us in terms of Indigenous knowledge, particularly as more we're welcomed more to engage in these kinds of processes, is that the security and longevity of our knowledge is really the cornerstone of our sovereignty and self-determination. So this is a really critical conversation to be having for us, because while we want to share our knowledge to engage more with the world and provide for better outcomes, it's also our knowledge, and we need to be able to determine how that knowledge is used, how we are engaged in these processes. This is going to be really important for us as we move forward. There are some things that Indigenous knowledge is not. So sometimes, especially in research, I find people who come up and think that our time and our labor means that we are contributing Indigenous knowledge. I'm thinking about community-based monitoring projects. These projects are not necessarily inclusive of our knowledge. We might be doing the work and we might be providing a lot of expertise, but if there is not space within research projects and in policy to very intentionally include Indigenous knowledge, we can't pat ourselves on the back and say that we used Indigenous knowledge as part of this process. Like, it needs to be very, very concrete, very intentional, and all community members who are involved need to know that it's happening. I can share just a couple more examples of like applications of Indigenous knowledge, particularly in the Arctic. I'll relay quickly a story that an elder in the Inuvialuit settlement region in Canada once shared with me. There were a number of polar bear biologists who were out in the region, and they were seeing this unusual behavior in polar bears, that the bears were coming up onto land and consuming large quantities of moss and lichen. And they concluded that this was starvation behavior in polar bears. And the community members knew that this wasn't true. And so actually what came out of it was that the Indigenous knowledge holders in the region were able to share very important information about basic polar bear biology, that in this particular region, when the female polar bears are ready to give birth, they come on the land to consume moss and lichen to empty out their digestive tract before denning and birthing. And the reason that I bring this up is because, one, we still are learning very basic biology currently. We're in a very data deficient region. Indigenous knowledge is really good at ensuring that we can do this well. The second is that these kinds of conclusions in research really impact our daily lives, right? And so it's really important to be sure that the information that we are getting in research and in science that is going on to inform polar bear policy internationally is good science and is good information. And Indigenous knowledge ensures that when we're putting this stuff together, that it's accurate and it's truthful, because as we know, science makes mistakes. And it's really important that community members can be involved in this kind of work. Other things that come up sometimes are, emergence of diseases like avian cholera. Like, Indigenous communities are really good at identifying the emergence and spread of these diseases that are plaguing places like Canada right now. But there are really, really concrete examples of how Indigenous knowledge is sometimes more spatially and temporally descriptive than is currently possible by scientific means. And then lastly, we have maybe future time to talk about ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge. And I had prepared a few thoughts on this, but I think it might be best to just move on and say that I'm really grateful that, and Inuit are really grateful that the UN and these big international forums are taking this kind of work really seriously, because it is very important to us that as we continue to engage, that there is a very respectful and equitable and ethical engagement of our knowledge in our communities. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Victoria, and just for sharing all that, including, I think the example of polar bears is really, it's actually one, it's a very good one because it's easy to understand and it's easy to make that distinction. So it's a very concrete example and appreciate that. Also, I picked up a lot on the point on what is and isn't knowledge, including when Indigenous people are engaged in community monitoring. That in itself is not necessarily a sharing of knowledge. I think that's an important distinction. So we now move on to our last speaker, Mr. Atencio Lopez. Atencio Lopez is a member of the Kuna people. He born in the county of Cunayala in Panama. He studied at the Panama National University Law School of Politics. He has also held various positions in Panamanian and international Indigenous peoples organizations. His professional background includes being an observer for the Organization of American States within Indigenous areas of Guatemala, a human rights observer for the UN mission for Guatemala, and an advisor to the president of the PANA Legislative Assembly. He's also coordinator for Spanish courses for the International Center for Indigenous Peoples. In addition to his contributions as a legal scholar and serving as a member of the General Kuna Congress, he has been a direct participant in a host of international government organizations ranging from the World Bank to the ILO to WIPO, and advocating in favor of rights of Cunayala and other Indigenous peoples. So thank you, Atencio, for joining us, and I turn it over to you. I believe Atencio may be frozen.
Yes, it looks like we have some technical difficulty, and you're right, he is frozen. Tiffany, are you available? Do you know exactly the details for his participation via phone, I presume, or?
We're trying to phone him in. Daly, we'll just give us 1 minute and we'll update you.
Okay, all right. Well, while we're waiting, I wonder if there is any commentary from the three presenters that have concluded their remarks about subjects that have been brought up by your colleagues online. If you want to quickly comment on something that has been already stated. Let's not all talk at once. Presently, no comments. And I suppose one other question is the Secretariat at the conclusion of the recording, if there's an opportunity to go ahead and edit out some of the rocky start of the seminar, but also, for example, this period of time here, wherein we don't have the next speaker connected.
Yeah, Daily. We'll do an edited version and put that on the online and on the web portal, and we'll also do the different language versions on the web portal.
Okay. One other opportunity might be to provide a comment about a couple of questions that appeared. In particular, there was a question about the sharing of the PowerPoint provided by EE and whether or not you're happy to share that information. EE?
Yes, I'm happy to share it. I even include some of the links so that you can further explore in case needed, but not all of them will be available in English because some of them are in our own language. But in relation to that, I also want to highlight that there are two parts. One part is that for us, in terms of climate change, we really want to contribute and take part like this kind of LCIPP platform. In there, I think there is already ongoing some of the discussion about some about the confidentiality, because in some cases when we talk about indigenous knowledge, we also say that confidentiality also important, especially when it's come under CBD, when it's come with like bioprospecting and things like that and doing research. At that time, it is very much important to have a transparent process, FPIC, and it is a two-way approach maybe. One is like to contribute with indigenous knowledge on climate action. On the other hand, when it's come to like something for someone's sakes, or something for we should avoid manipulation as well, means that there should have a good process we need to agree upon in terms of using those indigenous knowledge with the confidentiality. This is two parts to keep in mind. Thank you very much. But for my PowerPoint, no confidentiality. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment, and it absolutely intersects with Victoria's message about the ethical engagement of Indigenous knowledge and the project that is being pursued by the ICC. I see Tiffany is back on. I see Atencio is now with us. Maybe if you're able now, Atencio, to share via phone.
Daily, he's dropped off again.
Yeah.
We'll call him again and maybe ask him to keep the video off. That might be one of the reasons. We'll try one more time.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, again, to make use of the time while we deal with technical difficulties, is there any other commentary that the presenters have thought of that they would like to share, especially in relation to this question of ethical engagement, which I know will be the focus of one of our forthcoming sessions. I see now that Atencio is there, but I'm unsure if Atencio? Tiffany, do you have an update?
Atencio, ¿está usted está aquí? Quizás esté mejor sin video. Si se puede apagar el video, quizás está un poco mejor. ¿Nos escucha? Atención. Daily, he's dropped off again. Okay.
I think that given the circumstance, potentially we can arrange to have his presentation recorded separately and then edit it into the final. I think that that would be a possible solution unless he's able to arrive at a place where he can engage directly. So at this stage, it might be useful for us to now go to some of the key questions. But before doing so, it would be useful to ask Naomi, Victoria, and Ii if they have any other thoughts that they would like to cover before going to a question that may have appeared in the chat tool. I would invite Naomi or Victoria or Ii to make any observations that they would like based on the presentations that have been made.
I can speak a little bit if that's all right. Yeah. Someone in the chat had just asked for additional examples that are really climate change specific. Luckily or not in the Arctic. Oh, Atencio?
Hello.
Atencio? I think it's fairly clear that the quality of the sound is not going to be compatible with the present program. I'll invite you back again, Victoria, to pose a question or the observation.
Mm-hmm. So I was just gonna say that there are lots of examples, and it's unfortunate that we're a little bit pressed from time, and I'm sure each of us could think of many, many, many things. One thing that I think is incredibly pressing right now is that there's an increase in a lot of natural resource extraction here in the Arctic, and a lot of planned natural resource extraction, which comes with an increase in shipping. And with climate change, there's a lot of discussion right now within Inuit homelands about how we want to manage some of these things, particularly climate change related, like what refugia for wildlife, what special last places are we anticipating there being for potential new protected areas. There's one bilateral conservation area that is being negotiated between Canada and Greenland right now called Pikila-Sorsok, which is the last ice area. It's been called a few different things. It's one of the largest Arctic polynya where it remains open during the wintertime, and a lot of our wildlife go to that place. Narwhals, belugas, a lot of endangered species or species of concern. So there are actually a lot of like Inuit-led conservation efforts, a lot of Inuit-led projects to help sort of identify the places that we foresee in the future as being important places for not only our wildlife, but also for people and for being able to continue our culture and things like this. There's a lot of discussions right now. I think we're probably going to be seeing maybe 3 or 4 new protected areas in the Arctic in Canada in the next decade. There's a lot of work that's going on, not just with you know, identifying issues, but this adaptation and critical issues like that. Like people are thinking way far in the future already. And those are discussions that are happening all across Inuit homelands, including in Russia.
Thank you, Victoria. Naomi, did you want to share an example in response to the question posed in chat?
Yes, in Africa, there are so many examples of violations of human rights that actually that makes indigenous peoples really vulnerable to what is happening in climate change. There's a lot of businesses that are taking over lands of indigenous peoples, and there's no control, and it's happening all over Africa. And businesses are being supported by governments, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. But I was thinking the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in individual countries, and working with separate governments in the region, working with the African Commission to see how governments can be made to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, will bring about change that is required to bring about the respect that is required so that indigenous people would have their rights observed and respected by businesses rather than the businesses being supported by governments. And unless that happens, I think indigenous peoples are losing out, and climate change is going to destroy their livelihoods altogether. So I think all that should be approached from the human rights angle for indigenous people to realize their rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Ii, did you have something to add in terms of an example?
Yeah, I just want to answer too. The first thing is the government include about indigenous technology, because they want to give example with a certain type of ethnic group in our country. They have a floating garden or floating farming system, and in a big lake they have a kind of water hyacinth tuber. They pile it, and they make it as a kind of sediment together to form a small island, and on that they plant crops. The most famous one is the tomato. Tomato from their region is very famous for the whole country. So like those kind of specific agriculture system, the government include as indigenous technology in the NDC process, but there are a lot more to be included now if we want to say about indigenous knowledge, not only those kind of specific technology that they are referring to. That's what I'm discussing as part of NDC here. And some other example we can say a lot, especially when we say about climate change, the way people, indigenous people understand about the weather, things like that, no? For some indigenous group, they look at the birds, the way the birds are flying, either as a kind of a big group, and then it's like going to have heavy rain. And frog, the way frogs, the sound of the frog, they look at it as insect. If they come very near to the light, where there is light, things like that, then means there is a heavy rain. And the time the winter is coming, they look at it with a certain fruits or flower blossom or ripen, things like that. And then kind of rain, and they look at with the honey as well, whether the honey is thick or not thick, rain, how much rain it will come. And then listen to the sound of the animal, all the wildcat as well. They have a noise certain time, especially near to the winter time, things like that. Everything about the indigenous knowledge related to understanding on weather and looking at to the disaster, estimate of disaster coming up, and then do and don'ts so that they can avoid certain disaster and way of living. These are everything we talk about indigenous knowledge as part of this. And like if a big giant snake coming into the village, also it means that there is a danger coming to the village as well. So actually, like Karen people or some indigenous group, people eat snake, no? But like the snake big one coming to the village, mean at that time they should not kill that snake and eat it, because it's relate to the danger it's a sign for them, so they shouldn't do it, something like that. No, there are certain things. So as mentioned before, no, another important thing to do at this time, at this point in time, is also to have a pass through to future generation, because with the education system we discussed before, no, if those are lost, no, also we will lose valuable things from indigenous knowledge as well. And with the indigenous knowledge, they also noticed that in the past, even a rat's bamboo blossom and the rat's problem coming, they estimate every 50 years or certain timing, but now it's more frequent, mean more problem. The disaster is bigger, things like that. No, they have certain measurement of timing, and then those timing are changing, also giving more signs of problem happening at the natural environment, things like that. No, so these are some of the example. We can explore more because there are a lot of rich culture and indigenous knowledge in Asia. No, thank you very much.
Just a quick update. It looks like Atencio now has a better signal. And if so, let's allow him to unmute and join us. Atencio? Permiso. Atencio? Yeah, the sound quality is still not good. We don't have a good connection. See, Tiffany and Marcelo, if we can.
Hola, Atenti, muchas gracias. No podemos escucharle, así que vamos a recordar su presentación luego o mañana y podemos añadirlo a la sesión. ¿Está bien? Sí, muchas gracias y perdón. Okay, Daily. It's okay, Daily, I explained.
Okay, thank you. Just for the presenter, the other presenters and participants, you can be assured that we will record his presentation and edit it into the overall recording of the webinar. And it is unfortunate that he couldn't join us with good video and audio. I'd now like to turn it over to Eli to pose the next question for the presenters, and also make note of the fact that we have an additional 10 minutes beyond the 7:30 end time to entertain some responses from our excellent panel of presenters. So Eli?
Thank you, Daly, and again, thank you to all the presenters. We obviously are running out of time, and there's already been a few questions put into the chat function, and we will focus on the questions for the remaining of the session. So that this is obviously the intent is basically a learning platform. So I'm going to ask my colleague Tom, who's been tracking the questions in order, and I know we've just addressed one of them in terms of providing more examples. But Tom, can you start with next question, please?
Sure. Thanks, Eli, and hello everyone, and thank you to the speakers. I think the first question we received was from Laura of the Resilience Institute. And she would like to know, is there a difference between Indigenous or traditional knowledge and Indigenous values? Appreciating that knowledge is derived from values and worldviews, she's particularly interested in learning how Indigenous values and worldviews can inform policy and practices going forward. And building off that question, we had a similar question from David Hibar, asking essentially how much Indigenous knowledge can be shared or used without the framework of Indigenous values, including relationships or relational values within which the knowledge was formed. So I guess a curiosity about learning more about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values, and if there are distinctions.
Thank you, Tom. That's actually a very good question. I don't know which one of our esteemed speakers wants to try to tackle it first. All right, I see Victoria, go ahead.
Hi. I can only share the Inuit perspective on this. For us, our values are part of one aspect of our knowledge, and it is, knowledge that is passed on between people and generations. It's very difficult to separate the two, which comes to that second question, which is how do you use Indigenous knowledge without context for those values? I think it's very complicated for us. For Inuit, we're really pushing towards sovereignty of our own knowledge and our data. So we are happy to share that knowledge when it serves a specific function, and it's a function that we have agreed upon. But we also believe that once that function has been served, that perhaps that knowledge needs to remain with us, because that knowledge doesn't necessarily, without that understanding of the values, that knowledge loses a lot of its purpose. And it loses the nuances of, not only the explicitly said information, not the explicitly spatial information that might have been collected in like a mapping project or something like that, but it loses all of the other nuances and sort of that connectedness and holistic perspective that is often lost when we see, I come from more of a research background, but in research we see that often that context is lost in policy. That context can also be lost. We also have a lot of examples about how, like when our Indigenous knowledge is used against us, where our communities have been penalized for sharing information, which goes back to the trust issues. So our values of we share information with the intention of making the world a better, more equitable place, we expect that information won't be used against us. So our values are core to anything that is related to our knowledge, and I don't believe for us can be separated.
Thank you, Victoria. Did I see Naomi also put her hand up to, yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
Go ahead. I would say the same thing. I think culture and knowledge and values are all tied together, and it's very difficult to separate, to extract. Something is a value, but it's tied to an institution, a particular institution of the culture. For me, it's very difficult. I can speak like a Maasai, but I'm also thinking of the whole of Africa, a next community. What does the other Indigenous community feel like? So if I extract the Maasai culture where I grew up and I know, values are tied to spirituality, it's tied to institutional relationship between people, it's tied to the way of behavior, it's tied to how you treat other people as well as the environment. So values can be extracted, but in everyday living, everyday life, they're an intricate part and parcel of the culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. EE, did you want to add to that, or no?
No, I just want to support the two of them.
Okay.
I did the same as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may, I think one of the challenges here which brought on such a question, and I do take the point about how it's very difficult to separate them, is I think in Western cultures, we've been, whether it's through Hollywood movies or so on, we've seen a lot of how the portrayal of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge sometimes was portrayed more as a cultural or a thing rather than a knowledge thing. So I can see how it may be difficult for others and to understand how the distinction. So I really appreciate the perspectives you guys are providing on this. Tom, what's next?
Sure. Next, we have two questions from an individual identifying as an Indigenous person in Asia. The first was just a request to provide more examples of Indigenous knowledge and the application of Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate action. And their second question was discussing the loss of Indigenous knowledge in formal or Western educational systems, and was curious to know if any of the speakers had any examples where Indigenous knowledge has been integrated into formal education systems in a culturally appropriate way. So I'll leave it at those two, and we can take another round.
Thanks, Tom. I see EE. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to discuss about the education system. In Asia, there are some initiative of Indigenous themselves to mainstream Indigenous knowledge and knowledge and sharing of those at the education system at the kindergarten or as part of the curriculum, things like that. I have seen it in Sabah, Malaysia. And there are also culture and literature groups who are actively trying to maintain the knowledge, also to pass on. And also some other, like a religious group as well. There are different initiatives, but not yet in the political will or with the government-led program. Like in our country context in the past, even to learn our own language is prohibited to certain time. Now, in the education law, it's officially announced to learn our own language at the school system, but we still need more of a support. All the curriculum are still developed, something like that. But if we can learn our language at the school curriculum, we can include our part of our knowledge as well. But these are at the initial stage, and we need more support. And these are also important because we need to maintain our traditional value and the Indigenous knowledge as while we are trying to get the Western education system as well. So in the future, I want to see more of those more of support on those sector as well. And it has started. Just want to share like that. Yeah.
Thank you, EE. Do others want to jump in and maybe have examples of specific application of Indigenous knowledge in the climate context, perhaps? Oh, Naomi, I think.
I think the school system could allow, there's usually a fixed curriculum, and that is standard for everybody. Recently in Kenya, it has been easier to, they've changed the school term so that the December holidays is a little longer. So Indigenous peoples might have 2 months that they can practice, or they can, I guess, show or display some of the institutions that are important, that had not been easy to do during the school term, the school holidays, because they had been too short. So I think that allows, assuming the school system allows Indigenous people knowledge to be fed into the curriculum, it is feasible, but I think it has to be persuaded that this knowledge is relevant, because climate change is changing in such a way that livelihoods are affected. But it takes a political is take persuasion, a political persuasion to change the policy to allow some of that knowledge to be put into the curriculum, the school curriculum. Okay.
Thank you, Naomi. Maybe Tom, we'll jump to the next question then.
Sure. So I think we have a question from Matilda Sami. Considering that validation takes place within a knowledge system, can Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge be complementary to each other? In what way?
Okay. I see Victoria.
Hi, thanks. This one is really interesting to me as a research scientist and as an Indigenous person, because I see them as entirely complementary. And particularly that scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge are bringing very, very different kinds of information to the conversation that are both critically important in my field of work to the management of lands and species. We see that science is really good at simplifying things and technological advances that allow us to do things like climate modeling and all kinds of really sophisticated advanced math and things like this that we need as Indigenous peoples just as much as anything else. Like we need all the information that we can get as a global population at this point. But Indigenous knowledge is really good at specific things that science is not good at. And this includes the creation of baseline data. Like we have knowledge that stretches back a really, really long time. And sometimes if you're trying to recreate like what was a walrus population in the Pacific, like 600 years ago, like this knowledge, I mean, this kind of work is extremely time consuming. It's very expensive. It requires a lot of DNA analysis and things like that. But Indigenous knowledge can help us reach those numbers much faster. And like our collection of material goods and things like this are really, really important. We also are often the labor that is involved in collecting a lot of data. We're the ones who are out there all the time. Researchers in the Arctic come up for maybe 2 weeks a year, and then they're not sampling data from any of the other seasons other than the summertime. And so a lot of the data that's coming from the wintertime is really coming from our labor and our observations. And those are the times when, we can really validate not only within our own systems, but not that science should be validating Indigenous knowledge. I don't believe in that, but I think Indigenous knowledge can really help to validate science. Particularly when we're talking about wildlife populations and things like this. And we have many, many examples of accidental research gaffes. And actually a lot of Indigenous communities now are being asked to validate the results of scientific information because, we make a lot of mistakes up here, particularly because it's so difficult to live up here and it's very costly and so many reasons for why Indigenous communities, particularly up here, are an integral part of knowledge generation. And I see them as entirely complementary. And there are very few examples that I can think of where ultimately the scientific knowledge and the Indigenous knowledge were saying different things.
Thank you for that, Victoria. And I don't know if others want to add anything to that, or if we move on to the next question, just so we can gather more questions. Okay, I see head shaking. So Tom, what's up next?
That's the end of the questions that we've received so far in the chat.
Okay. Maybe I'll pick up on the last point Victoria just made. It's almost like it would be an interesting case study to look at the example of where traditional Indigenous knowledge and science and I guess Western science conflicted, I guess, in the findings. I don't know if you said it's rare, and that's, I guess, a good thing. Do you have an example of that when it may have happened, or?
Yeah, if you're bringing it back to me, actually, sometime back in the 70s, where ICC was just forming, and we were catalyzed around these issues of natural resource management and wanting to be involved in these things. So I'm from a whaling community in northern Alaska, like the largest bowhead whaling community in the world. It's not very big, it's only 4,000 people, but there was a time where some bowhead scientists had come up to estimate the population of bowhead whales, and they had estimated it to be in severe decline. And before talking to the community, they brought it to the government, and the government imposed a strict and immediate ban on whale harvests that year. The problem is that, like, we're so far north, we're at 71 degrees north, that we don't have a lot of options. Like we don't really have, access to groceries the same way that people do. We really, really live on the land, and we really lived on the land back in the 70s. So this was a severe blow to food security. And, a lot of people felt like they were being criminalized in their own homelands. And so a number of Inuit in the region got together and they said, you know what, this doesn't sound right to us. This isn't what our knowledge is saying. So the scientists came back up, and the community members spoke with them, and they said, oh, you're sampling, you're looking in the wrong places. They don't stay there in the winter. And the community was able to bring them back out and show them that the whales were actually choosing they have a different preferred habitat than the scientists had ever thought, and had never thought to look. And they were able to reverse the decision the next year. But this was a very, very trying year in our history, because it's not only like a very important part of our culture, but this is our food security. And this had real, like very, very extreme impacts on our community. And since then, this was sort of around the time that ICC was really getting on board with, like, we need to have more control over this process, because we can't go through things like this anymore. This is probably the first really big moment that this kind of research issue had come up, but there are many examples after that. Thankfully, we're getting to a place now as we move forward where researchers are more willing to engage more and figure out how to do this in a better way. But like I said before, like even very basic biology, we just don't know very much about from a scientific standpoint, and that's why it's really, really critically important to include Indigenous communities in this kind of work.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. So I know we are definitely over time. I do want to turn to Daly to maybe give us a quick summary, but one more check with Tom if there's another question before we try to wrap up.
There is one last question that comes from Alberto Salamando, and he asks, are there situations where one Indigenous knowledge holder feels a knowledge should not be shared, whereas other knowledge holders want to share it? So I guess the question about the collective rights concerning Indigenous knowledge and how those conflicts are resolved.
Oh, that's an interesting predicament. Who wants to try to address that one for us? And I gather it is a challenging question, of course. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands from our speakers, and that's completely fine. I understand. Okay, well, I'm not sure. Obviously, I can't answer that question. So why don't I turn it over to Daly to give us a wrap up, and maybe she might have any insights on that issue as well. And thank you again for all our speakers. This was really interesting.
Thank you very much, Eli. So once again, I greatly appreciate the expertise of the presenters, and I know that it took time and energy to prepare for this gathering, and we just greatly appreciate it and look forward to your contributions in the remaining webinars, as well as, of course, the submission of materials.
Daly, sorry to to disturb. I think your mic might be very soft. We can just hear you.
Okay, possibly I should just speak louder and move a little.
The volume is very, very low. Yeah.
Is that better?
Eli, can you hear Daly well?
Yeah, I was hearing Daly.
Okay, I'll start again.
I can hear Daily.